Greetings. If everybody can take their seat, we are intentionally meeting in this room so you can socially distance. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, which is the preeminent archive in the world for published and unpublished materials by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his most important British influences. The entire Wade staff, and most of us are here this evening, is delighted that you are able to join us for the first presentations in the 7th annual Hansen Lectureship, which was developed to encourage Wheaton College professors to engage with our 7 Wade authors. Made possible by Wade board member Walter Hansen and his wife Darlene, each series of lectures, which honor Walter's parents, Ken and Jean Hansen, has been published by InterVarsity Press. In fact, tonight we are launching the most recent Hansen publication, art historian Matthew Milliner's book, The Everlasting People, G.K. Chesterton and the First Nations, and it is beautifully produced. We have therefore invited Dr. David McNutt, Associate Editor at IVP Academic, to make a few comments about our collaboration. David.
I believe those are all of my students that you're hearing who are hoping for some extra credit. So, I am Dr. David McNutt, and I wear a few different hats. I do teach here at the college. Tonight it's Theology and the Arts. We're right down at BGH 130 if you're interested. But I'm coming to you primarily tonight, as Crystal mentioned, in my role as an academic editor at IVP Academic. I oversee a lot of projects there in theology and philosophy, and also in my specialty in the relationship between theology and the arts. And with that in mind, it has been my absolute pleasure to work with the Wade Center and the Hansens and all the faculty members who have contributed to the Hansen Lecture Series to also produce these books. So as Crystal mentioned, we have been doing this for a few years now, and I would say that one of the things that I have enjoyed the most about this is the unexpected. Anybody who has spent some time in an archive or a library knows the joy and sometimes the travails of chasing something. You find a reference to something, you're going to chase it down, and you have to look at 3 other things, and sometimes it leads nowhere, and other times it leads to a wonderful discovery. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Dr. Noll has to present of the unexpected things that he found with regard to C.S. Lewis. We certainly found that last year with Kristen Page's lectures on a sort of environmental interpretation of Tolkien and Lewis's fictional worlds and how that can inform our understanding of our world. And that was perhaps nowhere better presented, this unexpected, the coming together of unexpected things, than in the previous lecture series, Matthew Milliner's The Everlasting People is the final title that we chose. As Crystal mentioned, this is a reflection on Chesterton and the First Nations. And if you had a chance to listen to those lectures or watch them later online, you'll know that it was a lot of unexpected things coming together. And so we're so pleased tonight, not only to have the first lecture in this new series by Dr. Noll, but also to be able to celebrate along with Dr. Milliner the launch of his book. So it truly is my personal and professional privilege to be able to work alongside the likes of the Hansens, Marge Mead, all of the staff at the Wade Center, the Downings, and all of the faculty members who have contributed to the series. So I know that we're in for a treat tonight, and I look forward to seeing you at the book signing afterwards. So enjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. As Dr. McNutt mentioned, there will be a book signing after the presentations tonight, and tonight only, you get a 20% discount off of this book. So buy it while it's hot. We also have other books out in the foyer that were produced as part of the Hansen Lectureship, as well as some relevant C.S. Lewis books that are applicable to the lecture series that we are going to be hearing. So, without further ado, I should probably introduce the speakers tonight. Many of you know Dr. Mark Noll from his 27 years teaching in Wheaton's history and theology departments, during which time he was deeply appreciative of how his department chairs, Wheaton deans, provosts, and presidents facilitated active scholarship and publication. Himself primarily an historian of 18th and 19th century American religion and society, Dr. Noll has produced books on Christian faith during the Civil War, changes in American theology from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln, and a new work called America's Book, The Rise and Decline of a Bible Civilization, 1794 to 1911, is coming out this March from Oxford University Press. Teaching at Wheaton also gave Dr. Noll opportunities to write on the history of evangelical Protestantism, including his two books, The Rise of Evangelicalism and The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. He is an emeritus faculty member not only here at Wheaton College, but also at the University of Notre Dame, where he retired from the history department in 2016. Tonight, in the first of his 3 Hansen lectures on the reception of C.S. Lewis in the U.S., Dr. Noll will examine how American Catholics responded to Lewis's work. Immediately after he finishes his lecture, Dr. Karen Johnson will come to the podium to deliver her response. As Associate Professor of History at Wheaton, Dr. Johnson focuses on race and religion in U.S. history. Her first book, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, is titled One in Christ, Chicago Catholics and the Quest for Interracial Justice. Significantly, it was informed by her experience living in a primarily Black neighborhood in Chicago while working on her PhD and attending an interracial church. She is currently co-editing a resource for high school and college history teachers called Understanding and Teaching Religion in U.S. History, soon to be released by the University of Wisconsin Press. Immediately after Dr. Johnson finishes her response, my co-director at the Wade Center, Dr. David C. Downing, will oversee questions and answers from the audience, and you'll notice there are mics already set up for you, so you can just proceed to a mic to ask your question. And now, with really no further ado, and there has been a lot of ado in this introduction, I want you to join me in welcoming the internationally acclaimed Christian historian, Dr. Mark Noll.
Well, thank you to Crystal for that introduction. And it is indeed a signal honor to bring the Hansen Lectures at the Wade Center. I guess that's the Barrows Auditorium masquerading as the Wade Center. I'd like first to thank Walter and Darlene Hansen for endowing the lecture series in honor of Walter's parents, Ken and Jean Hansen, but also to thank those now departed saints, Ken and Jean Hansen, for their commitment to the Wade Center and to the Wade Center authors. I also owe a real debt to Crystal and David Downing as co-directors of the Wade Center, to Marge Mead, to Laura Schmidt, and other Wade Center staff who've facilitated particularly technophobes' handling of PowerPoint. I'm grateful to Jerry Root and then earlier Lyle Dorset for many hours of stimulating conversation on all things having to do with C.S. Lewis. And most of all tonight, I'd like to acknowledge my wife, Maggie, who did almost all of the research that I have organized for these lectures. When I was teaching at Notre Dame, Chris Mitchell asked me to prepare a lecture as part of an observance that he was organizing to remember the 50th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death. For this opportunity, Maggie assembled a nearly complete collection of early American reviews of Lewis's work. And it was a sad but also a joyful occasion, not so very long ago at the Bakke Center, to have the launch of the book in honor of Chris that it pulled together partially from the conference that he organized, and a first kind of short summary of Maggie's research. I was pleased to contribute to that book. Now, for nearly 80 years, C.S. Lewis has sustained an incredible popularity in the United States. The American publisher Macmillan brought out a New York edition of the Screwtape Letters on February 16th, 1943, a year after the book had been published in England. By the end of March, 6 weeks, rapturous notices had appeared in the Atlanta Constitution, the Los Angeles Times, the Springfield Republican, the New York Times, and the Christian Century. Commonweal, a magazine published by lay Roman Catholics in America, sponsored by the nation's Jesuits, joined the chorus of praise. Thought, a Catholic academic quarterly from Fordham University, had jumped the gun in January with a sparkling review of the English edition. Macmillan, sensing sales, in October of the same year, rushed into print two of Lewis's titles that had appeared some years earlier, Out of the Silent Planet and The Problem of Pain. Immediately, American newspapers, magazines, and journals sprang to celebrate these works with almost as much enthusiasm as they greeted the Screwtape Letters. And so it continues to this day, with Harper One leading a host of American publishers and keeping well over 100 editions of well over a dozen Lewis books in print. On Amazon.com's bestseller list, Screwtape is #1 in Christian classics and allegories. Various sets of the Narnia tales rank at the top of children's Christian faith books. 3 versions of Mere Christianity, print, audio, Kindle, are ranked in the top 10 positions for Christian apologetics. Outstanding recent books by K. Allen Snyder, George Marsden, and Stephanie Derrick have demonstrated that researching how, when, where, and why Lewis's writings became so popular delivers rich insights on the C.S. Lewis phenomenon. In these lectures, I'm hoping to go further with such explorations by examining the American reception of Lewis's work between the first American review of The Pilgrim's Regress, December 1935, and Lewis's appearance on the cover of Time magazine in September 1947. Tonight's lecture explores the many Roman Catholics who wrote about Lewis and his works during these years. The second lecture will examine Lewis's reception in journals, magazines, and newspapers intended for general audiences, or the academic world. The third lecture will explore responses to Lewis from mainline Protestants, fundamentalist, evangelical, and Reformed evangelical Protestants. In each lecture, I'm trying to answer this question first. How does examining the critical reception of C.S. Lewis by a particular American constituency illuminate the history of that particular constituency in the years surrounding World War II? In other words, can we gain deeper insight into that constituency by observing how it responded to Lewis's works? But at the close of the third lecture, I hope to address a more general question. By documenting the reception of Lewis's work and the various constituencies, what can we learn about the qualities of these works that made them so noticeable? Answering that question from reception history may also suggest how the approaches Lewis modeled might actually assist believers in addressing the public in our own day. Between 1935 and 1947, Americans enjoyed access to 17 of Lewis's books. They're listed on the back of your outline for tonight. Thanks to Laura Schmidt, you can be able to see some of the covers of the books as they appeared, at least if not in the very first American printing, soon. So 4 of the books were not actually published in America, but were available to American readers through the Oxford University Press. Earlier, in 1935, Sheed and Ward had brought out The Pilgrim's Regress in America after its publication 2 years earlier in the UK. Then Lewis's American publisher, Macmillan, sensing the popularity of the Screwtape Letters, rushed into print Out of the Silent Planet, and also, I think, The Problem of Pain that had been published earlier, and immediately in the years of the publication of Screwtape Letters brought these 6 titles into American audiences. And then in later years, they did not wait so long. They knew they had a hot commodity to market, and they brought 6 more of Lewis's books out for American audiences in 1945, 1946, and 1947. The American Catholic response to these works was remarkable in several respects. Catholic authors reviewed or discussed all 17 works. No other religious or academic constituency treated both popular and academic works so thoroughly. And what is probably still an incomplete accounting, Catholics published at least 34 reviews and 1 extensive essay review in Catholic publications, 5 substantial reviews in the major New York City newspapers, and an extensive 2-part essay in 1944 by Charles Brady, a professor of English literature at Canisius College, whom Lewis himself called the first of my critics so far who has really read and understood all of my books and made up the subject in a way that makes you an authority. Although these Catholic responses included some negative criticism, they were more generally positive about Lewis than any other American constituency. Not until 1946, when Chad Walsh, an Episcopalian English professor at Beloit College, began to publish on Lewis, did anyone else even come close to the breadth of Catholic treatment or the depth of Catholic appreciation. To explore this episode in reception history tonight, it helps to begin with a simplified account of the state of the Catholic Church in the 1930s and 40s, then a survey of which Catholic authors highlighted which features of Lewis's writing will make it obvious why he was received so warmly. That survey, in turn, puts us in position not to claim that Lewis exerted the kind of influence on Catholics that he would later exert on evangelicals. Instead, it will show why Catholic responses to Lewis provide a telling gauge for crucially important developments that were already underway in the American Catholic Church. So just a few words about the state of Catholicism in the 1940s. Catholics themselves have made some of the strongest statements describing the American church of this era as isolated, ingrown, defensive, intellectually feeble, and dominated by an authority structure with practically no place for lay initiative or lay agency. William Cavanaugh, a distinguished scholar at DePaul University, whose works has been much appreciated by Protestants, including evangelicals at Wheaton, recently wrote about the insularity of his parents' church in the 1940s, where he said, being Catholic was an identity mostly expressed by cheering on the Notre Dame football team. William Shannon, the founding president of the Thomas Merton Society, introduced the 50th anniversary of Merton's hugely popular 1948 autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, with an even bleaker description of the pre-Vatican II church into which Merton was baptized. And just a little bit later in the lecture, we'll hear about Merton's early review of one of C.S. Lewis's books. According to Shannon, Merton brought a breath of fresh air into the American church that was burdened with a straitjacketed theology, and now these are the Catholic Shannon's word, of prepackaged responses to any and all questions, polemical and apologetical in tone. Its aim was to prove that Catholics were right and all others wrong. With research relevant for tonight, Karen Johnson has explained the difficulties lay Chicago Catholics encountered when they urged their church to support racial justice. She quotes one priest of the era who, in a stereotypical view of the laity, claimed that their role was simply to pray, pay, and obey. Although these negative assessments about mid-century Catholicism do not tell the whole story, they suggest partial realities about a church whose increasing numbers, increasing wealth, and increasing educational attainments were only beginning to modify its insular and tradition-bound character. In addition, the years immediately after World War II witnessed an upsurge of American, and especially American Protestant, suspicion about Roman Catholics. Shortly before, as Catholics had joined with Jews and Protestants in the fight against European fascism, some of the earlier Catholic-Protestant tension had eased. But after the war, secular voices like Paul Blanchard of The Nation went on a rampage in a best-selling book that contrasted American freedom with Catholic power. The respected Protestant ethicist, Reinhold Niebuhr, expressed similar fears privately, while white evangelicals used the recently founded National Association of Evangelicals to repeat traditional American Protestant fears about Catholic intolerance and Catholic despotism. In a word, it's an exaggeration to say that the American Catholic Church in this era was feared, isolated, and ingrown, but it's not a complete exaggeration. 5 periodicals supplied most of the Catholic Lewis criticism. The nation's Jesuit community was responsible for America, a weekly magazine aimed at an educated general audience, as well as Thought, a quarterly published from Fordham University. Like America, the Commonweal was a weekly edited by educated Catholics for educated Catholics, but it was overseen by a lay independent board. The Missionary Society of St. Paul the Apostle, or the Paulist, had been founded in the 19th century by Isaac Hecker with the goal of presenting a positive view of Catholicism to an American public shaped by Protestants' long-standing disdain for their faith. The Paulists published The Catholic World, a monthly targeting the same kind of general audience as America and the Commonweal. Finally, the American Ecclesiastical Review, a monthly publication for the clergy, which was sponsored by the Catholic University of America, was the one publication where Lewis's work was not particularly well received. From the critical responses found in these journals, along with several reviews published in the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune Review, we can answer several pertinent questions. Who the authors were who interacted with the Oxford Don, whether they were clerics or laity, what they highlighted for praise and occasional disagreement, and how much they referenced other official Catholic teaching as they made their judgments. From first to last, in this 12-year period, the predominant note remained heartfelt appreciation. When in 1936, Father Bernard Conway reviewed the Pilgrim's Regress in the Paulist Catholic world, he could barely contain himself. Conway, who was the pastor of the Church of the Paulist Fathers in New York City, hailed the allegory as a brilliantly written volume with a devastating critique of modern philosophy, religion, politics, and art. The allegory, executed with consummate skill, was a clear-cut, logical, and effective apologia of reason and the Christian faith. We have rarely read a book we so thoroughly enjoyed. As the availability of Lewis's books increased, so also increased the chorus of praise, as when in late 1943, George Schuster published a strong commendation of the problem of pain in the New York Herald Tribune. Schuster, a layman who chaired the Notre Dame English department in the early 1920s, had then moved to New York City, where for several years he edited the Commonweal. Two of his early essays in that journal had complained about the general weakness of American Catholic intellectual life. When Schuster penned his Lewis Review, he was serving as president of Hunter College of the city of New York. The review stated that Lewis's account of a confluence of religious awe and the sense of moral obligation succeeded in presenting Orthodox Christianity with unusual effectiveness. Moreover, the book not only makes uncommon good sense, it is also great writing. In a later review in the same newspaper, another layman, Thomas Merton, praised the Great Divorce in similarly glowing terms. 5 years after this review appeared, Sugrew's 1951 book, A Catholic Speaks His Mind, received a great deal of attention for arguing that Catholics should work more harmoniously with their Protestant neighbors. Significantly, several priests responded just as positively to Lewis's work as these lay Catholics. In 1944, William Donaghy, S.J., then the associate editor of America and later president of Holy Cross College, called Perelandra a superb communique on the ageless battles with powers and principalities. He also claimed to know of no better portrayal of evil than that achieved by Mr. Lewis. Donaghy conceded that theologians may brood over some passages, but in his opinion, the only conclusion could be, this is great literature. The attention of Father Harold Gardner to Lewis was even more interesting. Gardner, also a Jesuit, studied English literature at Cambridge before becoming literary editor of America, and then a professor at the Catholic University of America and chairman of the board for the Catholic Book Club. Upon the American publication of That Hideous Strength, Gardner claimed about the entire space trilogy that no multiple decker among the literature of modern times could compare with Lewis's 3 in depth of spiritual insight and in dramatic interest. Gardner did opine that Perelandra remains to date Lewis's masterpiece, but for spiritual insight that flashes out on page after page, That Hideous Strength is a worthy successor, if not a peer. Earlier, Gardner had praised the broadcast talks published as Beyond Personality just as enthusiastically, but in a review with a telling sequel. In Gardner's opinion, Lewis's account in that book of matters like the Trinity and the whole magnificent sweep of our supernatural elevation in Christ would be a joy to Catholics and whatever sincere Christians there are, a revelation to sincere seekers after religious truth, and a challenge to priests and other religious instructors. Gardner did note that Lewis was silent on the fact that our supernatural elevation comes through incorporation into Christ's church. Nonetheless, he wrote, these reservations apart, the book is shot through with a clear understanding of and a fine reverence for the truth and beauty of the supernatural. In response to this positive review in America, one of Gardner's fellow Jesuits begged to differ. Philip Donnelly quoted an English Catholic author to charge that Gardner had failed to recognize a serious error in Lewis's book. According to Donnelly, Lewis based his account of adoptive sonship on the believer's own endeavors rather than following proper Catholic doctrine that depicted sonship as a supernatural gift from God. Gardner replied that he was glad to have this error identified, but that he still felt Lewis had done a good job in treating the supernatural in a wiser sense, namely the existence of God, the reality of sin, the divinity of Christ, etc. He got away with putting etc. in a publication. In this brief exchange, we catch a glimpse of the tension within the American church between expansive forces looking outward with Father Gardner and defensive forces standing with Father Donnelly in support for tradition strictly defined. That tension, illustrated in contrasting responses to Lewis' work between different Catholics, also appeared within individual Catholics, including the only American Catholic woman to write on Lewis in this period and one of the few women to address Lewis in print from any venue. That woman was Anne Jackson Freemantle, who was also the only English-born author and only one of 2 adult Catholic converts to review Lewis's books. Freemantle, a high-born supporter of leftist causes before her emigration to the United States in 1942, came into the church about the time of her arrival. She then went on to write for a number of Catholic and secular periodicals, to work for the Commonweal, Fordham University, and the United Nations, and eventually to publish a number of books for Catholic readers. In the span of less than 2 years, Freemantle published 3 reviews with kind words for how Lewis and Beyond Personality explained predestination and foreknowledge in ways with which St. Thomas Aquinas would have found no fault, and how in that hideous strength, Lewis evoked Augustine's 2 cities, the city of man and the city of God, with terrifying and thriller-like actuality. She also obviously admired the abolition of man with what she called Lewis's attack on the triumph of pragmatism and his depiction of what, in defending objective moral values, Lewis called this way, the Tao of the Chinese, the Rita of Hinduism, the way of love of Augustine. Yet with approval came also critique. In Fremantle's opinion, that hideous strength was nowhere near as effective as Lewis's theological perception in the screw-tape letters of the Great Divorce. More seriously, she faulted his depiction of Christian faith and beyond personality, which the Jesuit Harold Gardner had praised so lavishly, as neglecting the channels of grace that sustain Christian life. In her words, Lewis offered a picayune view of the church, she who is the whole Christ, who in her body and in that of each one of her members completes the passion. As we will soon note, at least a few other Catholics replicated Anne Fremantle's judgment. High praise for Lewis's stimulating prose, psychological insight, and basic Christian orthodoxy, but reservations about details of Lewis's theology and his apparent disregard for the church. Significantly, the 2 longest, most learned, and most laudatory examples of Lewis criticism by any American in this period came from Catholics who seemed completely untroubled by the reservations other reviewers raised. The first appeared in 1944 from the Canisius College professor whom Lewis had congratulated as providing a comprehensive account of all of his writings. Charles Brady, a graduate of Canisius, which is a college founded by Jesuits, returned to teach at his alma mater after completing a master's degree at Harvard. At the age of 24 in 1936, he became chair of the English department, a position he held until 1959, after which Brady continued to teach for another 20 years and then remained an active book reviewer for the Buffalo News for still two more decades. As an author in his own right, Brady published poems, fiction for children, including The Church Mouse of St. Nicholas, which told how an underweight church mouse had actually inspired the well-known Christmas carol, Silent Night. He wrote historical novels on the lives of Sir Thomas More and Leif Erikson. His anthology, a Catholic Reader, published shortly after he wrote about Lewis, began with Brady explaining that while an embattled church militant had required polemical writing since he wrote that far-off day when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door at Wittenberg, Brady wanted to show that Catholics could write sparkling fiction, exposition, poetry, anecdote, and essays that did not major in controversy. His anthology included selections from priests like John Henry Newman, Ronald Knox, and Harold Gardner, but even more from lay Catholics, including Thomas Malloy, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Hilaire Billock, G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, Clare Booth Luce, Thomas Merton, and Robert Lowell. The Jesuit magazine America published Brady's two essays, Introduction to Lewis and C.S. Lewis II, in 1944, and the titles were the only thing humdrum about these articles. In an immensely learned treatment, Brady explained how Lewis's academic writing on Shelley, Chaucer, and especially Milton informed his works for popular audiences like the Screwtape Letters, which Brady called the most phenomenally popular household book of applied religion in the 20th century. He urged his readers, however, to go beyond this one work to other writings, since Lewis was the only truly popular champion of orthodoxy in book, pamphlet, and radio address since the passing of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. In praising the inobtrusive learning behind the popular works, Brady claimed that the pages of Lewis's writing constituted a melodious sounding board, a whispering gallery of what is great in world literature. And then Brady specified as Lewis's sources Virgil and the Aeneid, R.H. Benson, Olaf Stapleton, Rider Haggard, Ronald Knox, J.R.R. Tolkien, William Morris, Jonathan Swift, John Henry Newman, Chaucer, Dante, and many others, including, again, John Milton. In this tidal wave of commendation, no hint appeared that Brady considered any aspect of Lewis's work questionable by Catholic standards. To the contrary, he contended that even the non-professional reader would benefit from the personal heresy, kind of academic work, and the other academic essays gathered in Lewis's rehabilitations because of their excellent humane scholarship. These works, according to Brady, revealed Lewis as a very humanistic and therefore Catholic don. In other words, since to this Roman Catholic, all truth is God's truth, and Lewis wrote so truly about so many aspects of human experience, it was appropriate for Catholics to regard the non-Catholic as a Catholic. Specifically, Catholic concerns surfaced only once in these two essays, when Brady chided reviewers for treating Out of the Silent Planet and Paralanda very shabbily, including some, he called them feckless Catholic reviewers who had missed the subtle defense of Christian orthodoxy in these works. For the rest, this first American to write comprehensively about C.S. Lewis's books offered his glowing introduction in a Catholic magazine with the express hope that more Catholic readers would be drawn to these books. I won't go into detail on the second major Catholic article. It was a lengthy essay review of Paralanda by a Marquette University English professor, a man by the name of Victor Ham, who was known as a translator of medieval Italian works. Like Brady, he too positioned Paralandra against Lewis's academic writing, again, especially with an emphasis on Milton. Ham's thesis explains why he thought Lewis's Paralandra was so great. Milton, he said, wrote the epics of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. Mr. C.S. Lewis has essayed the epic of Paradise Retained. Before turning to Catholic reviews that address primarily theological or philosophical questions, a pause is in order to take stock of the most obvious features of the main Catholic criticism. First, with near unanimity, Catholics welcomed Lewis's work for their literary brio, academic depth, imaginative creativity, and forthright Christianity. Directly or indirectly, they expressed the opinion that his writings were either fully or almost fully compatible with Catholic teaching, except for how they neglected the importance of the Church. Yet only some of the critics expressed that reservation. Many reviewers mentioned Lewis's lay status explicitly or conveyed it implicitly by referring to him as Mr. Lewis. While praise mounted highest for the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, and Paralandra, reviewers' criticism of other works was often they simply did not quite come up to the superlative excellence of those volumes. Lay Catholics outnumbered clerics as recommenders, but not by much. The English professors Brady and Ham made the most far-reaching assessments, particularly by showing how wide reading in ancient and modern authors made Lewis's academic writing unusually convincing, but also that this same intellectual depth provided a sturdy foundation for the popular work's attractive breadth. Stepping back only slightly for an observation about the context of these reviews, a variety of Catholic periodicals that were already well established provided ideal forums for wide-ranging discussion of Lewis's books. It's important to remember chronology. These early Catholic reviews appeared well before the Second Vatican Council. Catholicism was never as repressive, priest-ridden, monochrome, or as oriented toward salvation by works as Protestants regularly portrayed it, but the church was definitely traditional. It did regard all things Protestant or politically liberal as posing serious threats. It remained in general much less open to the world beyond Catholic precincts. That would be the case after the paradigm-shifting deliverances of the Council that did not convene until almost 2 full decades later. In that pre-conciliar world, American Catholics' responses that featured matters of philosophical or theological principle were particularly revealing. What substantive matters did Catholics regard as potentially objectionable from this non-Catholic author, and which drew their attention as gifts, unexpected gifts, for specifically Catholic ways of looking at the world? Serious theological objection to Lewis came only from the most conservative corners of the American church. It appeared mostly in the American Ecclesiastical Review, the quarterly from the Catholic University of America, the educational institution in the American landscape most closely associated at that time with Catholic traditionalism. Mild criticism that Lewis neglected the importance of the church became sharper in 1944 when the review assessed the problem of pain. Its Jesuit reviewer acknowledged this book's deep thought and refreshing originality of treatment. Then, however, it went on to say that the concept of the supernatural has eluded Lewis altogether, and that he has erred by interpreting the fires of hell figuratively. More far-reaching objections soon appeared from another Jesuit, Malachi Donnelly of St. Mary's College in Kansas. In a short review of The Great Divorce and a more extended assessment of Beyond Personality, Father Donnelly did not hesitate to acknowledge that Lewis's books contained much good and that he was a good man who was sincere with regard to religious matters and in his personal and deep love for Jesus Christ. Yet Donnelly was troubled by the same mistake as he saw it that had been noted in the objection to the positive review of Beyond Personality by Harold Gardner. In a word, Mr. Lewis's doctrine of divine adoption is not in full accord with Catholic doctrine. Now, it's going to be on the final exam for those of you who sit through all 3 lectures to try to understand why, when we finally get around to evangelical responses to Lewis, the conservative Presbyterians at Westminster Seminary made the same objection to C.S. Lewis, that in Beyond Personality, Lewis had talked about the process of Christian maturity as becoming either like God or God-like. So the conservative Presbyterians at Westminster Seminary and the authors who wrote for the Jesuits' America magazine really did not have too much in common, but they agreed on that criticism of C.S. Lewis. If, however, Donnelly was troubled by Lewis on doctrine, he was bothered even more by Catholics who had ignored a provision of the Church's canon law that required reviewers of theological books by non-Catholic authors to warn Catholic readers away from these books. He was particularly aghast, as he said, that among 4 of the more prominent Catholic periodicals, we have found that Lewis's Beyond Personality was enthusiastically reviewed to such an extent that the ordinary Catholic would have gotten the idea that there was nothing within the covers of this book that might be contrary to Catholic faith, especially with works from authors like Lewis with some admittedly positive qualities. Donnelly insisted that Catholic reviewers simply had to exercise cautious prudence when reviewing the book of a non-Catholic who writes on religion. These objections to Lewis' theology and the worry about Catholics reviewing his books without discrimination represented, however, a decidedly minority opinion, even when it came to the specific doctrinal questions. Much more strongly and much more often, American Catholic writers stressed how often Lewis's defense of objective truth, and especially his depiction of humankind's innate moral consciousness, reinforced fundamental Catholic teaching. One of the earliest and most intriguing Catholic responses to Lewis came when Thomas Merton published a substantial review of the personal heresy in the New York Times. This is a photo, actually, from Merton's passport before he became a monk. And if you've seen any depiction of Thomas Merton, you always see him in the monk's clothes. So I'm about as incompetent on electronic stuff as it's possible to be, but I'm really chuffed that I found this particular photo. The review was published in 1939, less than a year after Merton had sought Catholic baptism, and 18 months before he began his celebrated monastic career at the Cistercian Abbey of Our Lord of Gethsemane in Kentucky. In this jointly authored book, Lewis had tried to convince his literary opponent E.M.W. Tillyard that a poem should be read for what it says about the object of the poem, rather than read for what it tells us about the personality of the poet. In his review, Merton contended that Lewis used the term heresy not ironically, but in the technical Catholic sense, when arguing against the personal heresy. Whether or not Lewis intended to be that specific, the Catholic convert recognized a theological message in Lewis's literary work that fewer readers then, and not too many since, have been able to spell out so clearly. It's the message that human insights, human achievements, and human breakthroughs are best understood as reflecting an external reality rather than the genius of the human author. One of Merton's biographers has specified the connection between this commendation of Lewis's defense of literary objectivity and Merton's later fascination with Chinese Taoist philosophy. Merton simply read the ancient Taoist masters in the same spirit that St. Augustine read Plotinus or St. Thomas Aquinas read Aristotle. In this assessment, Merton's later fascination with Chinese thought that postulated universal and objective moral principles only repeated how key figures in the history of Orthodox Catholic theology depicted Christianity as clarifying, focusing, and fulfilling by revelation what the best non-Christian thinkers had found in nature. A recent book on Lewis's articulation of natural law doctrine details how a defense of objective moral principles, universal in application and knowable by reason, would become a central thread in nearly all of Lewis's writings. Precisely that defense excited early American Catholic reviewers who read Lewis's account of reason, the moral life, and Christian faith as an effective modern articulation of fundamental Catholic theology. On September 7, 1943, Macmillan in New York published The Case for Christianity, where in this edition of Lewis's first broadcast talks, he spoke much about natural law, or what he called the law of human nature. In the issue of America, dated only 11 days later, a reviewer praised the book for how Mr. Lewis, with irresistible logic, leads us to the universal natural law, our fallen condition, and the existence of the supernatural, and then shows Christianity as the most satisfying answer to our human dilemmas. Before the end of the year, a Paulist father would hail the book in the Catholic world for the timeliness of this gem of apologetics, with its emphasis on the fundamental needs of man regarded as a moral being. In recounting that for Lewis, the rediscovery of the moral law was his gateway to Christ, the reviewer conceded that Lewis did not write that book that in every detail a Catholic would have written. Yet he concluded that the case for Christianity said very many things that desperately needed to be said. As armies of men are groping their way back to the religion of Christ, this book will facilitate greatly that sacred journey. For American Catholics, Lewis' defense of natural law, what he called the Tao and the abolition of man, exerted a sustained influence. 10 years after The Abolition of Man was published, Notre Dame professor Leo Ward cited that book as a key text in a paper delivered to the American Philosophical Association. As one of the most respected philosophers of the day in Catholic circles, Ward was documenting what he called the natural law rebound. In Ward's view, the broad contemporary fact of totalitarianism had led to the rejection of John Dewey's relativistic pragmatism and a present-day affirmation of ethical universalism. Ward cited many authorities in support of his argument. Some were Catholics, like Jacques Marion, others were secular. He then wrote, however, "For our part, we take the statement of natural law by C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man as the most thoroughly existential and contextual statement in recent times. To Ward, Lewis had restated persuasively a foundational principle of Catholic moral philosophy better than recent Catholic authors who, according to Ward, were thought, and sometimes rightly thought, to be dogmatic rather than philosophically persuasive. An intriguing sidelight accompanied positive Catholic response to the abolition of man. The author of a short but glowing review in the Jesuits' Weekly America was Father John Lafarge, himself a Jesuit. Lafarge heartily endorsed Lewis's prediction of impending disaster should humankind ever give up the belief in objective moral values. Before writing this review, Lafarge, as shown by Karen Johnson, had led Catholic clerics in campaigning for racial justice in American society. Two details connect Lafarge's review to the racial challenge confronting American Catholicism. That challenge came from the fact that some priests like Lafarge, and even more nuns, had taken the lead in promoting civil rights. But many urban white Catholics, even sometimes their parish priest, resisted, sometimes violently, efforts to integrate the churches and schools that these immigrant communities had built up with such great expenditure of effort. The first detail, supplied by Karen Johnson, concerns Lafarge's attitude toward the laity. Although he was a leading progressive on race, Lafarge remained stoutly traditional, assuming the guidance for the church must come on social research and everything else from the bishops and the priests. The laity could help, but they could never lead. The other detail takes us back to Charles Brady's comprehensive review of Lewis's work. As an aside, Brady praised one particular scene from Out of the Silent Planet. It was a strangely moving encounter between Ransom and the Raza, which can be interpreted, Brady said, as an allegory of racial fear and repugnance and its sublimation into deep affection to the very recognition of the fact of difference. As it happened, Brady's interpretation of this passage surprised Lewis himself, who, in thanking Brady for the essays, wrote, "When you talk about meetings of human races in connection with Ransom and the Raza, you say something that was not in my mind at all. So much the better. A book's not worth writing unless it suggests more than the author intended." A possibility that did not register for Lewis, an American Catholic reviewer picked up as relevant for his church's challenge of reconciliation between not different races on Mars, but different races in Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee. Now, in conclusion, it should be clear why Lewis's early American reception proved especially significant for the nation's Catholics. As a first instance, their church was tied to a vision of authority that viewed it emanating almost exclusively from on high. Yet in modern America, lay Catholics were increasingly well educated, they had exercised an expanding range of free choices, and in many cases, they were eager to help shape the church's internal spiritual life and expand its social outreach in society. Much else transpired before the Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, and its stress on the central importance of the laity in constituting the people of God. But the enthusiastic commendation of a British layman for his compelling contribution to Christian witness marked a clear step toward fuller Catholic empowerment of the laity. Because this layman was not himself a Catholic, the warm response he received also pointed to the day when the once nearly impregnable barriers between Catholics and other Christians would crumble, not of course falling away entirely, but become much less imposing. If a substantial number of reviewers qualified their commendations by noting that Lewis was not one of ours, all but a very few who offered that reservation treated it as a secondary concern. Others, like Professors Brady and Ham, seemed already to be fully supporting the deliberate downplaying of ecclesiastical differences that Lewis would later call mere Christianity. The number of Jesuits who wrote favorably about Lewis or opened their periodicals for favorable commentary also deserves comment, perhaps especially at an evangelical college like Wheaton. In their American history, Catholics did not simply replicate European educational standards, since they required so much effort to serve the immigrant poor and carve out a secure foothold in a predominantly Protestant culture. But by 1893, the Jesuits were sponsoring 25 colleges. Many other religious orders and many local dioceses had contributed to the impressive number of 357 Catholic colleges founded during the second half of the 19th century. In Jesuit institutions and some of the others, the ideals of a thorough classical education eventually took hold. Their model, as summarized by John McGreevy, was the Jesuits' ratio studiorum that prepared students for fluency in Latin, led advanced scholars into Greek, and prescribed regular study of Cicero, Homer, Virgil, Horace, and other classical authors. The same program of studies featured a version of Thomas Aquinas on natural law, understood as preparation for the full Christian revelation. As the 20th century progressed, the curriculum at advanced centers of Catholic higher education broadened out, but while preserving a great deal of what had gone before. Even into mid-century, however, this education was focused mostly inwardly in preparing boys for the priesthood and young men, and eventually young women to act responsibly in their own spheres of influence. This educational background helps, I believe, to understand the enthusiasm that greeted Lewis from America magazine and Fordham's monthly journal Thought, that witnessed highly complimentary reviews from the Jesuit fathers Gardner, Donahue, and LaForge, and that led to the path-breaking essays from Charles Brady at the Jesuits' Canisius and Victor Ham at the Jesuits' Marquette. To be sure, a few Jesuits did uphold older standards in warning the faithful away from Lewis, but in the larger picture, commendation overwhelmed reservation. All who valued their education from Jesuits or at institutions aspiring to similarly high standards valued their first-rate classical training, and most also accepted the Church's commitment to natural law, philosophy, and theology. We do not have to imagine the delight such ones might experience when they read books by someone with learning just as deep as their own and a fresh defense of objective morality, but that also ranged more widely and was put to use with unusual creativity for both the enlightenment of the learned and the Christian encouragement of the hoi polloi. We do not have to imagine, because that is how they responded to C.S. Lewis. As we will see in our third lecture, what Catholics very much liked in Lewis's account of the natural law, Reformed evangelicals found most objectionable in their appraisal of Lewis's theology. But for Catholics, it was an unexpected blessing from an unexpected quarter. It would be incorrect to view the early Catholic responses to C.S. Lewis as particularly influential in shaping the course of the American church. By no means have I canvassed all relevant scholarship for the World War II era, but from fairly wide reading, I have found only one passing reference to Lewis for how a Jesuit in 1943 enjoyed identifying non-Catholics like Mortimer Adler and Lewis as fellow travelers defending an absolute moral order. Instead, Catholic writing about Lewis can be viewed as testifying to subterranean changes underway. In the late 1940s, the church seemed timeless, fixed, and immutable. Yet tremors underground were pointing to a new day for lay Catholic initiatives, a new season of edifying engagement with the world beyond the church, and a time when some who were not Catholic joined in defending objective moral reason. For registering these tremors, the Catholic reception of C.S. Lewis served as a remarkably prescient seismograph. Thank you, and we're eager now to hear from Karen.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate. It's just been such an honor. Dr. Noll argued that Catholics' reception of Lewis's work in the 1930s and 1940s revealed changes occurring in the Catholic Church. Most significantly, I think, the lay people's increasing exercise of their voices. Tonight, I want to highlight key components of Catholic priestly and lay reviewers' responses to Lewis by exploring something that might be surprising given our discussion of Lewis and Catholics, and that is Catholics and race. But when we consider the places from where reviewers were writing, perhaps the connections will seem more obvious. Most of Lewis's reviewers lived in northern cities, Washington, D.C., New York City, Rochester, Milwaukee, alongside most Catholics in the United States. The others lived close to major industrial centers like Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Kansas City. And starting in the 1910s, these cities were becoming the destination for Black migrants from the South who were leaving Jim Crow tyranny in pursuit of a promised land in the North. This Great Migration, as historians call it, initiated a crisis for white Catholics. And even though few of Lewis's reviewers were intimately involved in the crisis, their presence in those cities meant that they could not avoid it. The same tensions that Dr. Noll found in Catholics' reviews of Lewis's work shaped how Catholics navigated race. And looking at those dynamics alongside Catholic engagement with Lewis can help us see key dynamics in how Catholic laypeople increasingly exercised their voices. The initiative represented in the lay Catholic responses to Lewis can be understood more when we look at how Catholics engaged the racial changes in their cities. Many Catholics, including members of the hierarchy, resisted integration for complicated reasons, and Dr. Noll mentioned a few. But a handful of Black and white laypeople worked for what they called interracial justice. And by interracial justice, they meant that no person would face discrimination inside the church or in society because of their race. And they believed that they had to work together across racial lines to achieve interracial justice. This generation believed that they could change the world for Christ. Some would become priests, but most would live passionate lives as everyday people who tried to help others love God and love their neighbors within their own spheres of influence. They justified their actions, remember in this context of a fairly hierarchical Catholic church, using the doctrine of the mystical body of Christ. Being a member of the mystical body meant three key things. One, they could act as Jesus' hands and feet in the world. Two, they were united to all other members of the body ontologically, that is, at the core of their very being. And three, when they encountered a person, they could be meeting Jesus. This understanding of the mystical body enabled lay people to act both as faithful Catholics and as experts in their field, whether it be working for interracial justice or reviewing a Protestant author's work. In this framework, members of the hierarchy supported but did not usurp lay people when lay people were using their expertise. This transition to increasing lay authority within their areas of expertise was full of conflict, even when priests and lay people were working for the same ends. For example, John Lafarge, an interracialist priest who reviewed Lewis's work, hesitated to trust lay leadership, especially as a younger priest. In the early 1930s, Lafarge had helped engineer a priestly takeover of the national Black, lay-led Federated Colored Catholics. The debates were complicated. Should the organization prioritize interracialism or Black advancement? Were those two mutually exclusive? Who should be in charge, lay people or priests? And some Black lay people sided with Lafarge and his fellow priest, William Marco. Others sided with the Federation's African-American lay leader, Thomas Wyatt Turner. Historians debate the extent to which Lafarge's and Marco's concerns were racial, as in they thought African-American leadership was problematic, or hierarchical, as in they didn't trust lay leadership. Many of Chicago's Black Catholics threw in their lot with Lafarge and Marco for complicated reasons, one of which was that they thought they needed priests to advance their cause. But even as these Chicago Catholics supported the white priests in the Federated Colored Catholic conflict, they embodied the mystical body's doctrine and increasingly argued that they were doing Christ's work as they worked for interracial justice in their churches, workplaces, neighborhoods, and schools. And their actions often countered priests' explicit desires. They applied what they learned almost 30 years after that Federated Colored Catholics conflict, when Chicago's lay-led Catholic Interracial Council founded the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice, which was the first national organization since the Federated Colored Catholics to unite Catholics working on racial issues. They scaled up their model of lay leadership to maintain lay authority, and they refused to become a subsidiary of the bishop-led National Catholic Welfare Conference. By then, the aging Lafarge, who exercised more authority over the New York City Catholic Interracial Council than Chicago's Catholic Interracial Council chaplain, supported the National Conference's independence from the bishop's official oversight. This growth in lay people's integration of their faith with their work, even if they disagreed with members of the hierarchy about how their faith should manifest itself, offers context for the support the lay reviewers gave to Lewis. Dr. Noll showed that the periodicals meant for lay readers were much more supportive of Lewis compared with the American Ecclesiastical Review, which was meant for priests. Significantly, this growing emphasis on lay action did not undermine the church as an institution or as a concept. Rather, it expanded the church's reach and increased its significance. Dr. Noll observed that the main negative response to Lewis's work suggested, and here I'm pulling something out, that Lewis had a deficient understanding of the church. They were really concerned with the theology of the church. And this critique came both from the laywoman and Fremantle and the priest Harold Gardiner. As Fremantle wrote, Lewis had a Picayune view of the church, she who is the whole Christ, who in her body and in that of each one of her members completes the passion. This critique does not point backwards to an insular church dominated by priests, but highlights the corporate nature of a person's existence and the role of each person's suffering in benefiting the whole mystical body. Fremantle's mention that members of Christ's body complete the passion points to one effect of this unity. Catholics understood their suffering understood that their suffering could benefit other members of the body. Many Catholics, including those doing the difficult work of interracial justice, assumed that God did not call them to be comfortable. Otherwise, they could not do the challenging spiritual and relational work of loving one another across racial lines. Thomas Merton, one of Lewis's more famous reviewers, experienced the orthopraxy of discomfort firsthand when he spent 2 weeks at Friendship House, a Catholic interracial settlement house in New York's African-American Harlem community, which was connected to Father Lafarge. Merton visited in 1941 as he was discerning his vocation, after reviewing Lewis's personal heresy and before becoming a monk. Over watered-down soup shared with neighbors, Merton would likely have talked about the mystical body and discussed how members suffering completed Christ's passion as they contemplated bed bugs, no insurance, secondhand clothing, and what it meant to be white in a black context. He may have heard Ellen Terry, the famous black children's author, read her stories to neighborhood children, and they may have discussed what Terry later shared in her memoir and wrote in her letters, the difficulty of forgiving her white counterparts when they assumed they were working for her and other African Americans rather than with African Americans, making it difficult to explain white people's presence in a black neighborhood. But all around the table would have known that their momentary struggles would bring healing to Christ's broken body, a body broken racially in the United States. Theirs was a robust understanding of the church. That some Catholics who admired Lewis's work thought his understanding of the church was deficient points to differences in doctrines of ecclesiology between Protestants and Catholics in the World War II era. However, Dr. Noll raises another important question. Why were Catholics reading a lay Protestant writer and not demonstrating much concern about the different church backgrounds? After all, Catholic Church doctrine proclaimed the Catholic Church to be the only way to Jesus. Part of this answer can be attributed, as Dr. Noll does, with the increasing involvement of Catholics in higher education, particularly in the Jesuit schools. I want to bring into focus another context Dr. Noll alludes to that sheds light on this Catholic love of Lewis, and that's the shift in the United States' identity from a Protestant nation to a Judeo-Christian nation. And that's a term we're familiar with today, but it came into being in the 1930s, when groups of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews campaigned for broader religious inclusion. They argued that America was a Judeo-Christian nation in the context of fascism's rise abroad and increasing anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe. And many Catholic interracialists, aware of the magnitude of the problems they face, and knowing that most black people were not Catholic, partnered with men and women outside their faith. During World War II, as the government tried to unite the nation behind a common cause, Americans increasingly understood theirs as a Judeo-Christian nation. And by the 1950s, key positions in Chicago's Catholic Interracial Council were held by non-Catholics. Despite the very real resistance and fears of Catholicism that Dr. Noll documents in the 1950s, along with anti-Semitism in that period, the liberal Protestants, Catholics, and Jews' efforts bore fruit nationally. While some critiqued America's faith as vapid in the 1950s, a Judeo-Christian identity gave Americans one powerful way to distinguish themselves from quote-unquote godless communism during the Cold War. As President Eisenhower noted, when he tried to explain to a Soviet leader the basis of the American government, he fell short because he said, "Our form of government has no sense unless it's founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." With us, of course, it is the Judeo-Christian concept. Now, this quote has been widely discussed, but the key point here for our purposes is that by 1954, the president assumed that America was a Judeo-Christian nation, not a Protestant nation. John Kennedy's election in 1960 further illuminates the trend of Catholics' increasing legitimacy in the U.S. Even though the Catholic Kennedy had to do some serious work to convince Protestants he would not take orders from the Pope, his Catholicism was not a non-starter for the presidency. This sense of America as a Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish nation meant not only that Protestants assumed Catholics and Jews were fully American, it also was the context in which Catholic thinkers, both priest and lay, could praise a Protestant author writing on Christianity. So, where does this analysis leave us? How should evangelicals today think about Catholic responses to an Anglican convert's writings? I want to answer that question by considering what we might learn from the Catholic reviewers and their generation. While this history was lived out not all that long ago, the people inhabited a world that was different than our own, and those differences can help us see our own contexts more clearly. One of the most striking aspects of this period is Catholics' increasingly robust theology of a person's corporate connection to others through Christ. It's their ecclesiology, which contrasts the individualism that characterizes much of evangelicalism. Catholics' emphasis on ontological unity, that people are united in a mystical way, even if they don't embody that unity in the present, could help us see how we are united with others in Christ, including those of other backgrounds. And that unity is eternal. As Lewis wrote in The Weight of Glory, it is immortal horrors whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. We might think we determine our own destiny, but our lives are bound up in the lives of others in ways we do not fully understand. How can we put our influence at the service of others, helping them flourish? This concludes my response to your paper, Dr. Noll, and I do have one opening question for you as we turn to our Q&A. You've done so much work on American Christianity. So I'm wondering, what surprised you the most when you did this research on Catholics' reception of C.S. Lewis?
Yes, Dr. David Downing, the co-director of the Wade Center. I'd like to thank Dr. Noll for his address and Dr. Johnson for her response. And also I would like to thank Dr. Downing for introduction. And we have a lot of doctors here tonight. Dr. McNutt for his comments. Karen, did you want to repeat your opening question about the most surprising thing? You do see microphones in the aisles, so if you'd like to come forward, we'd be happy to take your questions.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, you know so much, Dr. Noll, but what surprised you the most in your research on Catholics' responses to Lewis?
I had known a little bit about the early and favorable Catholic responses, but when I read the Charles Brady essays, I was quite impressed that he explained a great deal of the popularity of the popular writings, Screwtape Letters, the Space Trilogy, by relating it to what Lewis had done academically and seriously as a literary scholar. So that was impressive in the first instance. But then trying to read about the other people who were interacting with Lewis into about 1950, nobody else did it, except Victor Ham, the Catholic literary scholar at Marquette. So that, I think, gave me an insight into not the character of American Catholicism, because that's a fiction, but the character of a thin slice within American Catholicism that was unusually prepared for the kind of sophisticated learning that Lewis brought to bear on amazingly popular writing.
It's interesting. There's an irony here because he's being so well received by these Catholic theologians, and his good friend J.R. Tolkien didn't like a lot of his apologetic work. He thought that theology should be left to professional clergy. So it's interesting that his own friend had more apprehensions than many of his Catholic reviewers.
I think Tolkien would represent someone older, and unlike the Catholics Karen was talking about, while believing in the mystical body, not seeing the modern implications that people like Dorothy Day and some of the racial reformers were seeing.
Right, that's true. I see someone standing up the microphone.
Did you find in your research into these reviews and reviewers that they provoked much response from the readers of these periodicals, letters of the editor, or other ways? How were people responding to it? Were they saying, yes, you've discovered our favorite author, or no, this is not right, whatever? Did you find anything surprising in readers' response?
There were a few letters, especially the one that I highlighted, where a fellow Jesuit criticized the approval for Lewis, but where actually Maggie had found more of what you're asking about were in little snippets in the Chicago Tribune, several New York papers, a couple of newspapers elsewhere, and there were institutions called something like the Catholic Book of the Month, or the Catholic Literary Guild, or what it was apparently a small group society of Catholics reading books, and very often Lewis's books showed up. Now, not Preface to Paradise Lost, but Screwtape Letters, Great Divorce. So I without having the research really to answer the question officially, I have the sense that these books were being read by a lot, and Macmillan went out of its way to advertise in the Catholic periodicals too. So if they were not getting any response from Catholic audiences, they probably would not have done that. So I'm actually trying to write the third lecture right now. I'm finding out that even though there's almost no evangelical or very little evangelical response to Lewis, and some of it is negative, there is evidence that people are actually reading Lewis with appreciation 41, 42, 43, before there's anything that's appearing in the magazines.
Lewis said, I like American reviewers. They seem to read my books before they write their reviews. He considered that quite a compliment.
It takes so much more time.
Yeah. Another question here?
Yes, as far as you're aware, did the writings of C.S. Lewis elicit any response or reaction from Fulton Sheen?
Fulton Sheen.
We have a Fulton Sheen expert sitting right here. Kirk, you want to answer that? Did Fulton Sheen respond to C.S. Lewis?
Did not anticipate that question tonight. In actual fact, Fulton Sheen, in his autobiography, Treasure and Clay, wrote that the two most important influences on his writing were G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, because he was a close personal friend of Chesterton's, even though there was a significant difference in age. But he liked Chesterton's economy of words, and he liked Lewis's phraseology. So I don't know of any interaction between Lewis and Sheen, but there was great admiration from Sheen for Lewis.
Lewis wrote to his friend's sister, Penelope, I'm surprised that you emphasize how much they did sense the theological substance of the fantasies. He wrote to his friend's sister, Penelope, you'll be surprised to learn that of 60 reviews of Out of the Silent Planet, only 2 reviewers have noticed that the idea of Maleldil is anything other than my own concoction of my imagination. And he said, I think that if the right Christian writer came along, they could smuggle any amount of theology into fiction without, under the guise of fantasy writing, without readers even recognizing it. So your reviewers that you quoted seem to pick up quite
They did indeed.
astute.
Chad Walsh will do that too, but he comes on a little bit later, and obviously Dr. Kilby will too. But yeah, just right away. And actually, some of the reviews, as we'll see at the next lecture, in places like the New York Times, by people not identified as religiously affiliated with, caught that message as well. I think that there's an insight in Stephanie Derrick's book about the reception of Lewis that I think is quite telling. And she records the kind of resentment that was felt in quite a few British circles against this learned scholar spoiling himself by writing for the popular audiences.
Right.
And I don't think that kind of attitude was present in the United States, which meant that there were more academics willing to read Lewis and say, well, wonder what we have here, rather than picking up Lewis and saying, well, he can't be worth anything because he's prostituting his great abilities.
That's true. That was a pretty strong backlash there in Oxford, was that you shouldn't be wasting your scholarly talent on popular writing. And then being a Christian as well, being a proselytizer and a popularizer, that's two strikes right there.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So I'm wondering, I'm thinking about the theology of Lewis, and I'm wondering the significance, and this is sort of counterfactual, so it's hard for a historian. We really can't answer these questions, I guess. But what do you think is the significance of Lewis writing as a layperson, rather than if he had been a trained Protestant minister?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think that actually is a question deserving more attention. And you think of who are identifiably Christian writers who are respected in the public sphere. I'm thinking that it would tend to be more lay people rather than academics. I mean, Sheen was respected in a sense, but yeah.
Well, Knox Ronald Knox.
Right.
Nowadays, when I think of public intellectuals, I think of David Brooks or Ross Douthat or David French are all lay writers.
Well, I think that the fact that Lewis would venture into theological topics without apologizing a lot. I mean, he did a little, but he just in effect said we have a problem with human nature. We have a problem with humans in relationship to God, and here's my response to it. And he's quite much more autobiographical. I found in reading even some more of his stuff, much more autobiographical than expositional. And I think that autobiography by a person who is not professionally responsible for earning his living by the religion was persuasive. And of course, Lewis's psychological insights are often penetrating, and that of course makes things more effective.
Did you run across the irony that Sheed and Ward brought out an edition of Pilgrim's Regress because they thought he was a Catholic?
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. Lewis was really upset when a couple of American reviewers called him a Catholic because it was brought out by Sheed and Ward. And Sheed and Ward did advertise Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress in the New York Times with Belloc and Chesterton and other Catholics. I thought I understood that they recognized who he was, and Lewis says he was glad to have Sheed and Ward pick up the book since Dent, the original publisher, sold so few copies. So the Sheed and Ward imprimatur was something that Lewis backed into, and he actually was very displeased. And he writes to his friend
Arthur Greaves.
Yeah, Arthur Greaves, some really disparaging things about Catholics. I mean, the reason Tolkien was a little nervous about Lewis as an Ulster Protestant anti-Catholic, and he had reason for being. I mean, he was young. Lewis was a young guy, but he worried that he told Arthur, his friend, look, if you find anybody who thinks in any way this is a Catholic book, you tell him that Wheaton Ward just is trying to sell it to the Dublin rabble.
Yeah, right.
This is our St. Louis.
Well, I think their blurb on the back said his journey from Puritania. They
Right,
assumed that
to
was
Mother Kirk, yeah.
Northern
Yeah.
Irish Protestantism. Tolkien said, you know, he tries to be a mere Christian, but often I sense a kind of ulterior motive in Lewis.
Well, we're going to see if any of you are still awake for the third lecture that one of the most interesting, the only evangelical review of the Pilgrim's Regress was written by a man who thought Lewis was a Catholic.
Oh,
And it was a positive review, 1936.
Another question here in the aisle.
I was wondering, are there other examples during the specific time in the U.S. that sort of reflect sort of this maybe a movement of increase in lay activity among the Catholic Church? So that, because it seems like what was happening in the U.S. and what was the situation, maybe the Great Migration, where the writings of Lewis were being so widely accepted. What other examples, what was happening in the U.S. in terms of the overall church movement that the situation was right for his writings to be so well accepted?
Karen, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, well, I'll tie it back to Wheaton Ward, actually, which was a Frank Wheaton, Maisie Ward were a husband and wife publishing team, and they produced this list that lay Catholics, a subset of educated lay Catholics, I should say, read. And it was like this sort of Renaissance moment for a lot of people where they thought, oh my goodness, this is not the church of my parents. And they could have some disdain for their parents, who one person who I wrote about in One in Christ talks about the cowed immigrant lot of people who came before her. So there could be a sort of a lack of humility. But I think Catholic interracialists were very involved in driving this. A lot had to do with Dorothy Day and the Catholic workers. So this is sort of the Catholic left. And one of the big, I think, things we should think about when we think about the Catholic Church is the diversity within it. Because this is a subset. There's both the traditional hierarchical church that Mark talked about, but also this flourishing of the laity.
There was an international movement beginning in the late 20s, early 30s called Catholic Action that is very well documented in other parts of the world for how it was beginning to engage lay people. Now, Pope John Paul II, in his very young days as a priest, was an encourager of Catholic action when he was in France, but also in Poland. In Canada, it's very clearly documented that the Catholic action programs and ideals of the 40s and 50s lay behind the very dramatic shift in Quebec in 1960s away from Catholic hierarchy. It's not as well documented for the U.S., although the Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement would be that would. But in some parts of Latin America, Catholic action is seen as a predecessor for liberation theology, theology of the base. So that would have been one vehicle that was enlisting lay people for reform. They weren't revolutionaries, and in some parts of the world where the changes took place too fast, it left some of the Catholic action people feeling that things had moved way beyond what they had wanted, how they had wanted them to move.
And Catholic action, I think, was really meant to be sort of yeast in bread. It was meant to leaven the church, and so they'd have cells of people who were workers in different industries trying to talk together and see what the industry was like or what was going on around them, to judge what should be done in light of the church's teaching, and then to act to make the world more like what they thought it should look like.
We're at 8:30, I believe, so let's take one last question from the aisle here.
Did Catholics who reacted favorably to Lewis, how did they react to Tolkien's works, if they did?
Could you repeat that question? I didn't get the whole question.
Sure. How did Catholics who reacted favorably to Lewis's works, how did they react to Tolkien's works?
Well, Charles Brady, who I quoted as this, writing this remarkable essay on Lewis, was an early and very positive reviewer of Tolkien. So I don't know in detail, but I just would be very surprised if there wasn't the same level of enthusiasm, but a different kind of enthusiasm, because the Lord of the Rings is really different than anything Lewis wrote. And although people in the know would recognize there's an awful lot of Norse mythology, Welsh, Gaelic etymology behind they weren't read that same way. And because the Christian element of the Lord of the Rings is much more
Implicit.
You don't have the same range of critical voices responding. But I'm sure Catholics ate him up. But like everybody else, right?
One Catholic wrote to Lewis and said, "You understand Catholicism so well. Why aren't you a Catholic?" And he wrote back and said, "If I explained my reasons, the only result would be that you would like me less." He didn't really want to engage in that sort of dialogue. He really wanted to have people celebrate how much they agree doctrinally rather than get into divisive discussions. That's a good question. We're about to wrap up for this evening. Just a reminder again that Dr. Matt Milliner will be signing his books, Everlasting People, out in the lobby. We have a 20% discount tonight. Join us again on February 10th here at 7 o'clock. We'll be hearing the second lecture about the more mainstream reviewers responding to Lewis during these years. The respondent will be Dr. Kirk Farney, the Associate Vice President for Advancement and also an Assistant Professor of History who finished his dissertation under the advising of Dr. Noll. So that should be a fascinating exchange. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.